Отак от буває, коли приходиш на українську землю. Отак от буває.
РФ.
Мы будем уничтожать врага на каждом сантиметре украинской земли.
Fuck you, Putin! Зажаль-то, блядь!
Буква З.
Incredible. As soon as the declaration is... Oh, fuck! That's a missile! That's a missile! That's a fucking missile!
Есть поражение. Наблюдаете? Разрывы.
Держи здоровье, я говорю, брат. Слава Украине. Оставь Россию. У меня начало снимать пэл.
Вы хотите декоммунизации? Ну что же, нас это вполне устраивает. Но не нужно, что называется, останавливаться на полпути. Мы готовы показать вам, что значит для Украины настоящая декоммунизация.
Это россияне.
Отак от буває, коли приходиш на українську землю. Отак от буває.
Твоя стейку золочи, да я твоя девочерная чекоє. Да я чекоє, не додого я
РФ.
Да я твоя девочерна, твоя че, да я неко, да я твоя девочерна. Да я твоя девочерна, твоя че, да я неко, да я твоя девочерна.
Мы будем уничтожать врага на каждом сантиметре украинской земли.
Fuck you, Putin!
Зажалька, блядь.
Да я твоя девочерна, твоя че, да я неко, да я твоя девочерна. Да я твоя девочерна, твоя че, да я неко, да я твоя девочерна.
Горели огни и от любви умирать. Может, рядом с тобой нам было хорошо. Что-то там за спиной меня так обожгло. Нежное обними, нежная опять. Мою руку возьми, чтобы вместе упасть. И в объятиях твоих хочу я дышать. Не могу без тебя
Буква З.
As soon as the declaration again. Oh, fuck, that's a missile, that's a missile! That's a fucking missile!
Есть поражение. Наблюдаете? Разрывы.
Держись дороже, я говорю, брат. Слава Украине. Создали Россию. У меня начало снимать был.
Вы хотите декоммунизации? Ну что же, нас это вполне устраивает. Но не нужно, что называется, останавливаться на полпути. Мы готовы показать вам, что значит для Украины настоящая декоммунизация.
Отак от буває, коли приходиш на українську землю. Отак от буває.
Hello. Hello, chat. How's everyone? Everyone hear me okay? Is everyone today? Everyone happy? No one in a war zone? No one in a country that's being beset by revolution? Anyone in a country that's in the midst of a financial collapse? Because some LGBT peoples in California can't run a bank. How is everyone tonight? So, this stream's going to be a bit of a hodgepodge of a number of different things I want to quickly touch on, and updates along the way. So it's going to be a bit here, there, and everywhere. I'm not too sure how long it'll go on for, but we'll just plow into it and see how it goes. So, our good friend Strelkov up on screen. I just seen this just before I came on air, and apparently it's legit, so I figured I might as well address it. Let's go. Yes.
Мы охуенная частная армия в мире. Мы ведем набор бойцов из всех регионов России. Не дрочи, а иди на работу в ЧВК Вагнер.
So what that is this is, as you can see, Pornhub. This is pornhub.ru for Russia. And my Ruski is nowhere near enough to understand what was really said through most of that advert, but this apparently is an advert. If you are a Coomer, if you are a Rusel, a Russian Coomer, and you want to go off and find a girlfriend in Ukraine, by hux or by crux, you are in Russia and you call this number. Apparently, this is how you join Wagner PMC. Wagner is recruiting on Russian porn sites now. So yeah, that is the natural progression of World War III, the beginnings of World War III. Prigozhin has addressed this, and he said, join Wagner PMC, and yeah, stop jerking off. He apparently contracted out the Wagner recruiting to a Russian marketing website who thought that it would be a great idea to put up Wagner recruitment ads on Russian porn sites. So this is where we are. I guess with all those Coomers, there must be a lot of pent up testosterone, a lot of Russian Elliot Rodgers out there who could put their life to better use than sitting in there. Khrushchevskas, Brevzhivskas, however you pronounce it, their apartment blocks cooming off to stuff that Russian Coomers coom off to. So there you go. If you're a Russian and you need a girlfriend, call this number and you'll go on a whoring trip to an Eastern European country. So that is where we are. Recruiting for war on porn. Welcome to 2023. At least it's heterosexual porn, I guess. So, well, that's the first thing. I guess the next thing is we'll just get Georgia out of the way. A quick update on Georgia. So, my last previous stream, if you haven't watched that, there was a large protest, basically a attempted color revolution in Georgia over a pretty minor law that Wastoids and global homo types couldn't be completely detested and despised. The president in the United States, sucking off her masters, condemned the law, said she was going to veto it. The Georgian government climbed down, has pulled the law, but they might bring it back at some point. But nonetheless, the law is effectively dead at this point for the foreseeable future. Various Westoids and other degenerates and vile influences, baleful foreign entities started to do their usual song and dance about how great democracy in Georgia is saved and all this. And it's kind of seemed a busted flush. The Georgian government, despite climbing down and issuing an amnesty to the protesters who sort of started a fight back, came out and outright claimed that foreign influences, Western influences, were interrupting in the internal processes of Georgia, disrupting Georgian democracy, and has come out swinging, rhetorically at least. And I have a bit of a video. Not only that, there is now a counter-protest movement, as some people are calling it the Georgian Maidan. And as always, you cannot have a Maidan without a anti-Maidan. So... Okay, let me just... One second, am I still being heard? Hello? Oh, okay, I see what's happened here. So I got a bit bamboozled. OBS is a bit too deep for me, but I understand now. So I got a bit of a video. This is anti Western Georgian nationalists, not necessarily pro-Russian, no, most certainly not pro-Russian, probably very anti-Russian. They've been holding their own demonstration of sorts in Georgia, and they did some pretty based in red pill things, so we'll have a look at what they did. So let's have a look at this video, and hopefully it doesn't blow your guys' ears out. So So that, as you could see, was Georgian sovereignists. I guess you might call them nationalists. They are not pro-Russian by and large. They are people that believe that Georgia should be its own sovereign independent state, by and large, from what I could read into it. They are not they might be, well, obviously the group that pulled down the EU and NATO flags aren't, but some of them might be open towards EU membership, but they don't like westernization. These are the people who regularly protest Tbilisi Pride. These are the people who are, from what I could gather from my looking into it, that the junior coalition partner of the Georgian government, this is sort of their electoral base. They believe in a sovereign independent Georgia on its 1991 borders, a pragmatic relationship with Russia and a pragmatic relationship with the West, but they don't like westernization, globo homo, all that kind of stuff. And that was their counter demonstration to the recent color revolution attempt in Georgia. So as you can see from the footage, it looked like there is a sizable number of them. And interestingly, I did notice that a couple of them were flying the Adjarian flags, which is a highly autonomous part of Georgia with them. So Georgia, I'll keep an eye there and see how things go. But that's sort of the wrap up on Georgia there. So the next topic I'll come to is, was this breaking? We in breaking news, just as I was going to come and talk about this. No, it's not for that. Stop. So the next thing I will talk about is the lovely country of Moldova. And I'll bring up a handy map, because I know you guys like me whenever I spurg out over my maps to get the geography. So we'll give a quick rundown of Moldova and Pridnestrovia for the next little while, which is probably going to be the majority of the stream that I wanted to cover. Should have covered it probably a bit earlier, but the stuff kept happening. So kind of like what I did with Georgia, I'll give a quick rundown on Moldova, Pridnestrovia, and why it is in the news a lot the past couple months. So, people who are geographically illiterate, this is Europa, here is Russia, there is Ukraine, there is Gypsy Romania, and between Ukraine and Romania you have the small, I'm sure very delightful country of Moldova, and then between Moldova and Ukraine, you have a little sliver of land along the Dniester River called Pridnestrovia, the Pridnestrovian Moldovan Republic, something like that. The PMR, or as Westoids like to call it, Transnistria. And there's been a bit of argy-bargy between these two countries for a couple of decades, but especially in the past, since the war has begun, and in the past couple of months. For a bit more detail on this, if you're really that interested in stuff in Pridnestrovia, I did a stream with a guy called, an American expat called Sam, who lives in Tiraspol, which is the capital of Pridnestrovia, which is here. He lives there, so if you go watch my stream on that, I think it was like in April or May last year, it'll give you a bit more understanding and insight into what it's like to live in this area. But, so, just a quick rundown of the history. We're going back to the medieval era, kind of same sort of period as whenever I was doing the Georgia stuff. Ottoman Empire takes over the Balkans. Before there was the modern consciousness of the Romanians were known as the Vlachs, VLACH, and there was two client states, puppets, vassals, marches, however you want to describe it, Vlach states between the Ottoman Empire and the growing power of what was then the the Habsburg Empire, the Austrian Empire before it became the Ottomans. The Austro-Hungarians. Then you had the Lithuanian-Polish Commonwealth. To the north, you had the Crimean Tatars and various Khaganates and the Tatars hanging about in what would become Ukraine. You had the Cossacks up in this area, and then you had the growing power of the Tsardom of Muscovy, and then the Tsardom of Russia slowly across the centuries, pushing in from the north. So you had an independent Romanian Vlach state to the south called Wallachia, I believe it's pronounced Wallachia. And then you had up in this area Moldova. I believe the Romanian Moldova was actually further to the west than what it is now, but that's sort of the basis for where these sort of identities come from in this area, because of course Romania is not it doesn't really have a lot of historical unified statehood. Romania only unified in the 1800s along with many other countries. So that's up until about the 1700s, mid to late 1700s. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth falls away. The Habsburg Empire takes over what is now Transylvania. This area is populated a lot by Hungarians. That's kind of the source of a bit of ethnic strife there historically. You've got the Russians push into what is now the lands of Ukraine. The Crimean Tatars and the Tatar Khanates that used to inhabit this part of the area went on slaving raids, acted as a buffer state along with these Romanian Wallachian states, as a buffer against these growing powers of these Northern European and Eastern European states. The Russians take over the Muslim states in Ukraine, in what would become Ukraine, and start to push up along these Romanian states here. I'm trying to run through a lot of history here because it's very complex and the like, but throughout the late 1700s and the 1800s, Russia and the Ottoman Empire have constant wars. Every few years, you would have the Turkish Russo-Ottoman wars. This is how Russia pushed into the Caucasus. This is how the borders of most of what is modern Ukraine. This is how Crimea became part of Russia / the Slavic world, was these Ottoman-Russian wars. So you have the growing power of the Tsardom, then the Empire of Russia, encroaching upon the Black Sea. They come across these Orthodox Christian, ethnically Vlach states. Romanian Vlach is sort of like the old term for Romanian. As part of various wars with the Ottomans, the Russians secure quasi-independence, but in turn these sort of principalities sort of come under Russian influence strongly and sort of Russian suzerainty. The Russians then establish the independent state of Bulgaria. The Ottoman Empire effectively sort of goes off the map, as it were. So we're pushing up until round about the start of World War One. World War One, in the 1800s, the two independent Romanian principalities unite into a unified Romanian state under a German king. I believe he was a Saxe-Coburg. World War One comes along. Romania stays out of it at the start, but then Romania joins the war and gets defeated by the Central Powers. Then the Central Powers start to lose the war, and Romania joins the war again at the tail end. And then Romania is united with ethnically Romanian, but there's also a lot of Hungarians in this area, so that's kind of how the modern borders of Romania are established. A lot of this area comes under Romanian control, under the Romanian Kingdom. So you come up to World War II. Obviously, this is now the Soviet Union. The borders of the Soviet Union at the time were a lot further to the east. Half of Belarus was part of Poland. A large part of Western Ukraine was part of Poland. Romania contained this area to the north. Chernivici, I can't pronounce that, but this part of Ukraine used to be part of Romania, and I believe the Budjak area was part of Romania as well. Then Funny Mustache Man comes along, Operation Barbarossa. The Germans go east. As part of the occupation of Ukraine, what was meant to become the Reichskommissariat, parts of Soviet Ukraine are passed to Romania to be occupied and eventually actually annexed into Romania proper, into the Kingdom of Romania. So I believe the city of Odessa, as far east as Odessa, was to become part of Romania and came under Romanian control. And this is kind of where the modern basis of Moldova and Pridnestrovia comes from. I believe the governorate, the sort of German Romanian administration in this area, was called Transnistria. Pardon me. Of course, Transnistria across the Dniester, because this is the river Dniester. That's where the name comes from. So this is why Pridnestrovians, as Sam eloquently pointed out to me, don't like the term Transnistria, because it to them that is what the mid-century Germans and funny mustache man called this area. And if there's one thing that Slavs, Russians, and Russian-leaning Slavs hate, it's anything that sort of leans towards funny mustache man whenever he was attacking them. So that's where the term Transnistria sort of comes from in its modern parlance. Obviously, funny mustache man and his sharply dressed soldiers don't do well in the Soviet Union. They get pushed back. While the Soviet army starts to push into the borders of the Kingdom of Romania at that time, because of course Romania was a pro-Axis state. It fought with the Germans in the Soviet Union. There is a coup, a pro-Soviet coup happens in Romania. Turfs out the pro-German government, institutes a pro-Soviet government. Romania flips sides onto the Soviet side and fights the Germans and the Hungarians. World War II ends, and then, as we discussed in the last video with regards to Georgia, Mr. Borderman, Stalin, comes in with his ever great understanding of ethnic division and borders, and establishes the modern borders of Ukraine. So this is where this modern internationally recognized border to the west of Ukraine comes in. This is Stalin's invention. So all this part that used to be part of Eastern Poland in Belarus and in Ukraine, which used to be Polish, then becomes part of Belarus and Ukraine. Transcarpathia, which used to be part of Hungary, becomes part of the Soviet Union, but the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And in regards to Romania, you have this Chernovitsi area, which is outright annexed from Romania straight into Ukraine. The Budjak area is annexed into Ukraine, well, the Soviet Ukraine. But then also, this is where modern Moldova comes from. Instead of annexing the old Moldovan Principality lands into Ukraine, instead they split that off from Romania, annex it into the Soviet Union, but as its own Soviet Socialist Republic. So it becomes a constituent republic of the Soviet Union. So it has the level of autonomy, but you know, how much does autonomy count for whenever you're a constituent part of the Soviet Union with a communist party? But nonetheless, that's how the borders of modern Moldova come to be. So you have, through the Soviet period, you have Sovietization of the population. Of course, Romania has Ceausescu, so this is all part of the Warsaw Pact. You have Ceausescu comes to power in Romania. This is kind of, Moldova is kind of a bit where the Romanian Soviet, it's not really a split, but Romania wasn't as invested or as involved in the Warsaw Pact as other states were. It preserved a fair amount of autonomy from the USSR. Part of that reason, that sort of standoffishness, maybe even coldness between the Romanian communist state and the USSR, was this issue over Moldova. Ceausescu, alongside being a communist, he was a fervent Romanian nationalist. He believed in a large Romania, a large populous Romania of its historical borders. And of course, Moldova being one of the two Romanian black states that retained independence throughout foreign domination from the Ottomans, the Habsburgs, and the Russians. The fact that this was now broken off from Romania and part of the USSR was a bone of contention. So We come up to the end of communism, the late 80s, the 1990s. The Soviet economy starts to go into collapse. That builds up a lot of ethnic division. But through the Soviet period, you have the Sovietization of the population. You have ethnic Russians, ethnic Ukrainians, Slavs are moved into Moldova, but also as part of, a lot of people call it Russianization. I don't think that's a fair term, because that implies that the Soviet Union was and only ever was a Russian construct, which it wasn't. But I prefer the term Sovietization. It's sort of the assimilation and integration of various peoples into the Soviet state. It does carry on from the Russianization of the Russian Empire, but with very big caveats. Sovietization, of course, state atheism, but alongside that, the common language of the USSR, of course, being Russian. So you have the promotion of Russian and the Cyrillic alphabet in the Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic. You have the immigration, the internal immigration of ethnic Russians and Ukrainians, particularly, into Moldova. And this sort of sets the stage for the early 1990s, where the conflict and the breakaway happens. So USSR collapses. Moldova, the Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic, declares its sovereignty. Again, very similar to the situation in Georgia, declares its sovereignty from the USSR. Then the coup happens in Moscow. The referendum happens on the Union state. I believe Moldova is actually one of the states that voted to retain the Union whenever the first vote on the Union Treaty came about. But in the aftermath of the coup in Moscow, and then they all held their independence referendums, that's whenever Moldova, well, the Soviet Socialist Republic of Moldova properly left. So alongside this time, you have a growth in both Moldovan and a Romanian nationalism. So you have a lot of Moldovans who feel themselves to be ethnically Romanian, and they aspire to the unification of Moldova with Romania. This is a trend, a current in politics in the region. I believe it's termed Moldovism. Moldovism, or is that the other one I'm looking at? I should probably just clarify that before I... No, I've got it the wrong way around. Forget what I just said. So Moldovism is something else. So you've got this promotion of a unification union between Moldova and Romania. That causes a lot of problems for people who don't feel Romanian. Ethnic Russians, ethnic Ukrainians, ethnic Slavs, various ethnic groups such as the Gogos, of my pronunciation. It's these because in this region there is quite it's a very diverse ethnic region. It's between the Slavic world and they're not Latin. They speak a Latin language, but they're not ethnically Latin. The Vlach world and the Balkans. So there's a lot of ethnic groups in this area. Some small, some larger than others. So you have these different people, these different ethnic groups that sort of are awakening themselves. They would have all largely felt as Soviet, but now that the Soviet Union has collapsed, they are scrambling to find a new identity that they can cling to. So, like I say, you have people in newly independent Moldova who want to unify with Romania. But then you have people who are dead against that, largely ethnic Slavs, but there are also ethnic Moldovans, which I guess you could say are Romanians. They would be ethnically Vlach, but they have been Sovietized to a degree, who reject union with Romania and want to preserve a Moldovan independent state. This is where Moldovanism comes from, Moldovism. Moldovism is the idea that Moldova is its own independent state. It is its own nation separate from Romania and other states. It seeks to create a national consciousness, its own nationality. As part of this, this sort of dispute in the early 1990s, fears of the potential unification of Moldova with Romania sparked ethnic strife in Moldova, especially to the east, where Ukrainians and Russians are a larger part of the population. To the south, you have the Gogos people, and their own area. They start to agitate for independence and breaking away from Moldova because they don't feel themselves Romanian. And the state sort of looks kind of like Georgia at one point during its early independent history. In the 1990s, looks like it's about to implode and collapse. Alongside this, you have a number of Soviet army troops that are based in this area, because don't forget, this is the western borders of the USSR. You have a lot of Soviet troops through late 89 into 1990 into 1991 are withdrawing from the old former Warsaw Pact states. So you're talking from places especially like the old Czechoslovakia, from Hungary. There wasn't a lot of Soviet troops in Romania, but some in Bulgaria. Whenever they were withdrawn, they largely built up in Ukraine and in Soviet Moldova. This is kind of where the basis of the infamous ammo depot, which is up in this area, I believe it is, if I'm not mistaken. There is a large ammo depot up in northern Pridnestrovia. That came about from all this old Soviet munitions and stockpiles of ammo in the old former Warsaw Pact states. It was stockpiled there whenever the Soviets had to move it out of the countries that had just left the Warsaw Pact. That is part of the reason why there are Russian troops there, but I'll go into that in a little second. This growing ethnic strife between the idea, is Moldova Romania, or is Moldova its own state, or should Moldova still maintain very close ties with Ukraine and Russia? This eventually spirals out of control into a small conflict that lasts a fairly short number of times, and the number of deaths are surprisingly low for it. But the old autonomous, I believe this was an oblast, an old administrative division of the old Moldovan Soviet Republic, declares its sovereignty from Moldova, and the newly established Moldovan state tries to re-establish its control over this area. There is fighting breaks out, and the old Soviet army, which then passes under Russian control. So these Soviet troops then come under Russian command, take the side of Pridnestrovia in that conflict. It should be said that at this time there is chaos in Moscow. The USSR has just collapsed. No one really knows what the military chain of command is. Technically, up until the late 1992, I believe it is, all the old Soviet military is still under a joint command under the Commonwealth of Independent States. But that doesn't last long, because all the independent countries are jockeying for their own power, trying to establish their own control over the military units in their own territory. So the military situation and exactly who's calling the shots for the Russian/Soviet troops in Pridnestrovia, Moldova, is very confused. But nonetheless, it seems to be that the Russian troops in the area, with a tacit approval of Moscow, act of their own autonomous accord and intervene decisively into the Transnistrian Pridnestrovian conflict, and largely push out the Moldovan attempt to establish control over what would become Pridnestrovia and decisively end the conflict there. And that's kind of where the situation has been ever since. So as part of that, you have a Russian quote-unquote peacekeeping operation that is established from this time to maintain the ceasefire in the area. Up until 2014, the Ukrainians were happy to support this. The Ukrainians allowed Russian military troops and supplies to go through Ukraine to support this Russian military effort in Pridnestrovia. But it should be said that the Russian garrison there has always been quite small. It's been, I think it topped out at about 8,000 troops in the 1990s, and I believe it's around about 2,000 men now. These aren't combat troops. They are there as just like conflict monitors and to prevent any conflict from erupting. Alongside this, through the 1990s, Moldova is probably the worst post-Soviet state whenever it comes to corruption. Ukrainians and the Russians really had it bad. The Moldovans seem to have perfected corruption to another level. Moldova enters an economic crisis which it has never really emerged from. As part of this, Moldova effectively disbands its military. It sells off its small air force. It sells off its tanks. Most of its old Soviet military equipment it sells off. And Moldova to this day, I believe, has around about 5,000 soldiers, but they are effectively like militarized police at best. The Pridnestrovia has a larger military in terms of, I believe, manpower and equipment than Moldova. And this is a sliver the size of Moldova. So that's kind of the situation in the 1990s. But Moldova kind of goes through this nuanced period. So Moldova, you have a large nostalgia for the Soviet Union, for the Soviet period, the complete collapse of the economy. There actually isn't a lot of mineral assets in this area. The economy is largely agricultural. The situation in the south with the Gagauz people is rectified to a degree. Gagauzia is given a large amount of autonomy, but it remains as part of Moldova. Pridnestrovia is separated from Moldova, and the 1990s and the 2000s is a period of just economic decline and chaos, like most of the US former Soviet states, but Moldova, it is on another level. This creates a lot of nostalgia for the Soviet period, and this leads to the election of communist parties, Marxist-Leninist parties, and socialist parties. And this is kind of where you get the divide in Moldovan politics. Moldovan politics is divided between Western-leaning, pro-Romanian, potentially unify with Romania liberal parties, and Russophone, Russophile, pro-Moldovan independence, Moldovanism, leaning communist and socialist parties. So that's the split in Romania. Up until fairly recently, you have the quote-unquote far left, who actually tend to be more socially conservative than the liberals. You have the communists and the socialists, who believe in a independent Romania and closer relations with Russia and Moscow. They look to the east, the Russophone, and then you have the Romanian-looking, EU-aspiring, pro-Westernization liberal parties, who, and now Moldovan politics sort of goes back and forth between the two. And then in the PMR, you have Pridnestrovia, which sort of plugs along happily in a surprisingly well-ordered state, from what I can observe, detached from Moldovan politics to a large degree. But of course, Pridnestrovia is still uses Soviet iconography. It's one of the few countries, post-Soviet countries, that still uses the Soviet emblems and Soviet iconography in its state emblems and flags and such. So, alongside that, as I mentioned, with the Russian peacekeepers in Pridnestrovia, you have a Russian monitoring mission that monitors the ammo depot. Again, I think it's either up here or it's around here. It's somewhere around here. But so alongside the peacekeepers, you have another Russian military mission that comes into Pridnestrovia with the idea of just monitoring the ammo depot. Because for the, like I say, there's a lot of munitions that came from the Warsaw Pact, and if there's one thing that Slavs do, it's they don't really store stuff very well. This is probably why we're not seeing a lot of Russian T-72s and T-80s coming out of storage. The Soviets and Slavs, Ukrainians, and Russians especially, whenever they have excess military goods, their sort of mentality of what you do with it is you stick it in a field and you leave it for a couple of decades. That is what this ammo depot is. This is stuff that's been there since the late 80s, if not before. It has been left in... There are some bunkers, but there's a lot... For decades, there's been a lot of concern from the United Nations, from the EU, from outside powers on this ammo depot, because of the way the weapons and the ammo is stored. Moldova, it is in Eastern Europe, so the winters can be quite cold. The summers can be quite warm. Through the elements, this ammo can start to degrade, become unsafe, and that is kind of what the fear is at the moment. There's also fears that criminals and terrorists might get into the ammo depot and take some of the munitions and weapons for use in nefarious schemes elsewhere. The Russian monitoring mission there is to monitor the situation with the idea of eventually dismantling the ammo stocks. But since 2014, in the Euromaidan, the Ukrainians cut off all contact for the Russians through Ukrainian territory to Pridnestrovia. So all the Russian troops here have not been resupplied since at least 2014. So their equipment's probably getting a bit old. How usable it is another question. There has been reinforcements, but the way the Russians have sort of rotated their troops in and out of Pridnestrovia is they fly... Before the war, they flew in replacements into Tiraspol, which is the capital of Moldova, as tourists. And then these tourists would conveniently go to Pridnestrovia and then perform a 6-month tour military duty in Pridnestrovia. So that's kind of how the Russians got around the reinforcement aspect. But Western and Ukrainian and Moldovan sources for a number of years have claimed that the Russians had no intention of dismantling the ammo dump in Pridnestrovia, because it was an excuse to keep extra Russian military troops in the territory. Because this adds into a wider aspect of Russian geopolitics, which is something I did my dissertation on, is Russia has a habit of intervening in these post-Soviet conflicts and never quite decisively ending them, keeping them at a sort of unhappy state. So in Georgia, they affirm the independence, the de facto independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, but they don't force the Georgians to recognize this. So this is what is called a frozen conflict, and this serves Russian geopolitical interests. So that's what it is in Georgia, and that is what it is in Moldova, and this might be what we see happen in Ukraine. So what is the idea behind this? Why are the Russians doing this? Why don't the Russians force the Moldovans? Like, why didn't the Russian army go into Moldova and force the Moldovans to recognize the independence of Pridnestrovia? Why have they established the de facto independence of this state, but left it at such a state where geopolitically it's not recognized by anyone else, and it's an anomaly on the stage? Well, by keeping this situation in Georgia and this situation in Moldova the way it is, these countries can never join NATO, and it also opens the door for Russian influence into these countries. So if you have physically Russian troops in what are internationally recognized as Georgian borders, well, that creates a vessel for influence, how you can influence the internal affairs of Georgia through threats or through various political promises and diplomacy. In Moldova, the same case. So going back to what I was saying, that sort of movement where there is a growing sense of Moldovans that they should reunify with Romania, well, it was understood in the early 90s that a lot of these countries had decisively moved out of Moscow's sphere. It was sort of nuanced whether Russia was willing to become part of the West, whether it was going to become a party or a partner of the West, or whether it was going to become a supplicant, or in a future tensions with the West. So this is kind of where the Russians hedged their bets. So if you keep Moldova out of Romania, you sort of keep these sort of potentially future NATO European borders further to the West. This is where the big problem with Ukraine comes from with the Russian idea, because countries that have ongoing territorial disputes generally can't join the EU, but absolutely cannot join NATO. So That is how the Russians locked Moldova and Georgia, at the least, out of NATO because of these ongoing territorial disputes. And this is where the concept of frozen conflicts come from, these post-Soviet frozen conflicts. Why the Russians put peacekeepers in Moldova. Why are the Russians so involved in establishing a peacekeeping operation around Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan? Well, there's an ongoing territorial dispute between both of these countries. Both of these countries will never join NATO, and they'll almost certainly never join the EU, but it allows Russian troops to operate in this area and exercise influence into both of these countries, into Georgia and into Moldova. So alongside this, the Russians, I don't know too much about the dynamic between Pridnestrovian and Moldovan diplomacy between them to really go in depth onto it, but while Moldovan politics is split between the Russophone communists and the Westernophile liberals, that is another aspect of how the Russians sort of influence internal Moldovan politics whenever they needed to. If you have a party that is avowedly pro-Russia, pro-Moscow, and anti-Western, obviously that allows Russia to potentially move in and put a bit more in-depth influence internally into the politics of Moldova. But largely Moldova has kind of been, and I don't want to be offensive to any Moldovans, but largely it's irrelevant through the past couple decades to wider European and regional politics. Its prominence has only sort of come up since 2014. So coming up to 2014, obviously Crimea goes to Russia. Ukraine and Russia come at odds. Pridnestrovia becomes a sort of enclave cut off from its benefactors to the east. Obviously, you have a pro-Western revolutionary government in Ukraine. It falls out with Russia quite spectacularly. It cuts off all supplies, Russian military supplies to Pridnestrovia. And that's whenever Moldova elected its liberal president now, has started to exercise a bit more influence onto Pridnestrovia. So in Moldova, which kind of leads into what has been happening the past couple of weeks, this concept of Moldovanism, this idea that Moldova is its own independent state, the Moldovan people are their own nation separate from Romania and other peoples. Alongside this, it promotes things like that Moldovan is a separate language from Romanian. I believe a large part of that is writing Romanian or Moldovan in the Cyrillic alphabet, as opposed to the Latin alphabet, which Romania uses, and sort of things like that. Adherence to the sort of more pro-Russian sections of the Orthodox Church, as opposed to the more pro-Romanian aspects of the Russian Orthodox Church, and a sort of hankering back to Soviet era nostalgia and sort of celebrating Victory Day on May 9th as opposed to May 7th, and similar aspects such as that. So alongside this political division in Romania, in many ways I guess it's quite similar to Northern Ireland now that I sort of speculate and look at it. You have this sort of cultural divide in Romania between sort of more pro-Western Romanian in Moldova, more pro-Western, pro-Romanian Moldovans, and more pro-Eastern, pro-Russian Moldovans who sort of view Moldova as its own state. So the war happens, Russia invades Ukraine, the Russians advance quite rapidly in the south. Lukashenko gives a press interview which appears to show that Russian troops, had they made it, had not been as incompetent as the invasion plan was. If things had gone to plan, Russian troops, when they made it to Odessa, there was a big arrow pointing into Moldova. I think that is probably likely. I think the Russians probably had that on the plan. It's hard to explain because before the war, on Felix's Discord, I had like a 5-hour conversation outlining this, but this sort of goes into my own personal speculation, so take it or leave it as at that, about what the Russian war aims were at the start of the war. Had everything gone immediately to plan for the Russians, had it gone all to plan as what the Russians seemed to have expected, there was no problems. I think that the Russian army would have pushed up to the borders of Poland and have pushed into Moldova as well, and established a new frontier along the western borders with the EU states from Romania all the way up to Poland. Why do I think that? Well, there was a thesis. George might remember it, but I wish I recorded it now. But a couple of weeks before the war, back in 2022, there was a big conversation in Felix's Discord where I sort of outlined why the Russians might go in and what they might do. I sort of speculated, well, the Russians could have gone in small, which ironically they probably should have in hindsight, where the Russians did a small level invasion of Ukraine, just looked to take over the east, secure the Donbass republics, and that would have been the height of their goals. But that would have locked forever any rapprochement with Ukraine going forward, and it would have resulted in sanctions and a permanent fallout with the West. It would have isolated Russia. So my sort of assessment was, and I think it was kind of right in my assessment, it was just that the Russians hadn't prepared for it themselves, that the Russians could go in small and take a small prize but suffer a large penalty geopolitically because of it. Or the Russians could just decide, okay, if we're going to suffer the large cost geopolitically from sanctions and being locked out of international diplomacy and economics, well, we might as well go for the large prize. And the large prize was Ukraine and Moldova. Both of these countries are not secured by international treaties with NATO and the EU. I don't think the Russians ever wanted to annex any part of Ukraine outside of Crimea and maybe the Donbass. I don't think the Russians were really looking to do that. I think what the Russians were looking to do was to effect a change in regime, swap out the Zelensky regime with a controllable pro-Russian government in Kiev. And I think at the same time, the Russians would have crossed the border into Moldova potentially and done the same there, swapped out the Liberal for the Communist Party and the Socialists, the pro-Russian party in Moldova, and established new frontiers to the west. And that would have been the big prize. Suffer a large cost, complete lockout from the east, from the west, but at the same time, you win the biggest prize had the Russians been able to have pulled it off. So obviously that whenever Lukashenko did that press conference and seemingly inadvertently revealed that the Russians had planned to go into Moldova, and Western intelligence seemed to have implied it as well, that caused a lot of concern in Moldova, because Moldova at this stage is governed by the Liberals, the incumbent Liberal president Sadu, and a parliament. So they start thinking, well, the Russians seem to have had us on the chopping block as such. We need to start really integrating to the West. Well, Moldova is very economically dependent on Ukraine and on Romania. Well, if you have a war in Ukraine that sort of collapses the economics of Ukraine, that causes a significant problem in Moldova. A lot of Moldovan gas and electricity was sourced from Russia. A lot of that has been cut off, and this has led to a lot of strife in Moldova. So I'm sure most of us are aware that there is inflation. Things are more expensive. The global economy isn't the best at the moment, even before this banking problem that we are currently going through. You have to understand Moldova, it is on another level. This is a country that has never really moved beyond the Soviet economic crisis it suffered. It is almost universally agricultural, and its politics is heavily corrupt. So the war causes a profound economic crisis in Moldova. Gas and electricity spirals through the roof. Well, spirals in the terms of what the living standards are for Moldovans. Moldova's largest export partner outside of Romania is severely disrupted. Its other large export partner in terms of Russia is effectively cut off. But alongside this, you have Pridnestrovia, and largely because I think Pridnestrovia is one of these sort of Belarus kind of situations of post-Soviet countries whereas most other countries just devolve into pure corruption and nepotism and gangsterism that set the 1990s. Pridnestrovia seems to have gone under this sort of like what Lukashenko did in Belarus, that corruption was kept to a standard. It was kept to a certain acceptable minimum. It wasn't run out of control. The state was ordered. Police aren't exceedingly corrupt. You can sort of expect the state institutions to function appropriately. Alongside this, I think this comes into, well, one, Pridnestrovia sort of, from its inception, had this existential threat to it from Moldova. How viable that was whenever the Moldovans effectively abolished their military is here or there. But this is why I think Ukraine, to a degree, has outperformed what we expected of it compared to the Russian army. The Russians didn't have this existential threat as pertinent to it as, say, like Pridnestrovia and Ukraine. So corruption, incompetence, all the things that have hollowed out the Russian army was allowed to propagate and not be properly dealt with. Whereas in Pridnestrovia, well, this is a country that is not internationally recognized. There is a constant threat potentially of military attack. So the Moldovan state has to perform. Its military has to be kept to a certain bare minimum to ensure the viability of the state. The country is completely economically cut off from formal global economic levers. So the state has to function to it. Either the state could just become a gangster state. It could involve an arms trafficking, drugs trafficking, this sort of bizarre narco kind of state. It didn't go down that route. It seems to have decided, okay, we're going to live up to the old Soviet legacy, an ordered, formal state with a bit of a market economy that tries to function as much as it can within the economic system that is put upon it. So the whole point of what I'm trying to say is that Pridnestrovia seems to have weathered the economic problems from developing from the war substantially better than Moldova. So you have Pridnestrovia sort of plugs along for the past year. Obviously very concerned by the war that's happening in Ukraine and completely cut off from its military guarantor in Russia. But in Moldova, you have this economic freefall. You have a sharp polarization of politics in Moldova. You have Western influence that starts to creep into Moldova, starts saying, well, the Russians were going to invade you. Maybe it's time to really start to pursue EU membership, start to look for security and economic guarantees from the West. The opposition, the Russophone opposition, is obviously dead against this. The people in Gagauzia, this sort of very autonomous ethnic republic to the south, they start to get very concerned because the Gagauz are constantly saying that they will break away from Moldova if Moldova ever tries to join the EU or NATO. Gagauzia and Pridnestrovia, they look to become republics of Russia. Some sections of the politics in both of these republics outright say that they want to join Russia as a constituent part of Russia. How viable that is whenever it's a landlocked place surrounded by hostile states. They can get away with it in Kaliningrad because there is that sea link to Russia, but how viable it is here. Russia has always sort of rebuffed these aspects because of this this landlocked nature, and also if they were to become parts of Russia, it kind of removes the frozen nature of the conflict. But politics in Moldova becomes very polarized. The pro-Russian or more Russia-leaning opposition in the socialists, the communists, and you also get a populist nationalist right-wing party that arises over the past couple years. So it's not just the communists and socialists, you have now a populist, socially conservative nationalist party that's growing in the polls in Moldova. They start to agitate for the past couple years. in Moldova against the government. The government's corrupt. The government's not dealing with the economic crisis in Moldova enough. The government's more interested in selling us out to Western powers and special interests and look after Moldovans. And this starts to ferment through the past year in Moldova, up until what we've had the past couple months. So, woo, I've really tried to get spurg out a lot onto chat, so I need to take a little break while I just get that's sort of the history done. So the past couple of years since the invasion has taken place in Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, Moldova has sat very uneasily where it is. You have the liberal government that is trying to steer, kind of like what Georgia was doing, as much as it can on a pro-Western, pro-EU path. The Moldovan Prime Minister and the Moldovan President start to go on TV with a Moldovan and an EU flag behind them now. Not an EU state, but like Georgia decides to put the EU flag up everywhere. This really agitates the opposition. The Russians, I think it is pretty much the Russians as well. Not to say that there isn't an organic influence of this. I do believe that there is a lot of very pissed off people in Romania who have their own grievances, but I also believe that they are getting support and encouragement from Moscow in this. Start to destabilize the situation in Moldova. You have the Ukrainians this has been for a while now. You have certain rumblings in Ukraine encouraged by certain Western actors saying that the Ukrainian army should go into Pridnestrovia because of the Russian military mission in Pridnestrovia and remove that and effectively take over Pridnestrovia and hand it back to Moldova. The Russian military mission in Moldova, I believe it's around about 4,000 to 5,000 troops. Speaking to Sam last year, and it's kind of pretty obvious at this stage, these are not combat-ready troops. 5,000 Russian troops are not about to cross the border from Pridnestrovia and invade Western Ukraine. The Ukrainians, by certain accounts, have up to 50,000 men along this border. So, I don't even think there's much of a intelligence aspect that the Russian troops could really do here. I think kind of like what the Russians are doing in Belarus by sending their troops into Belarus to just get trained up by the Belarusians. By the fact of having Russian troops in Belarus, that requires the Ukrainians to tie down men and material along the Belarusian border. And I think that's kind of what the Russians are looking to do in Pridnestrovia by having a small amount of troops here that are effectively combat ineffective. You tie down Ukrainian assets to monitor the position on the border. But this came to a head the past couple of months because Ukrainians and certain Western aspects have really ramped up the idea that Ukrainians should go into Pridnestrovia. I think the Pridnestrovian army would probably put up a fair amount of resistance. They seem to be fairly well organized, and what equipment they have, it seems to be in fairly good condition. But needless to say, a battle-hardened and trained Ukrainian army would roll over Pridnestrovia in a matter of days, if even that. But the problem there is, if the Ukrainians did that, I believe I touched on this in a previous stream, one, this is Ukraine invading another state. Even if the Moldovans invite them in, well, this is going to set a match to a tinderbox in Moldova, because you have a very angry Russian-leaning opposition in Moldova, and you have people who want to largely be part of Russia in Pridnestrovia. So if the Ukrainian army goes in, well, they're going to have to keep troops in Pridnestrovia, because the Moldovans don't have an army. There's like 5,000 men in the Moldovan army, and they have no tanks, they have no heavy equipment. It's effectively a militarized police. So Ukrainians will have to stay here to keep control of the territory, because the Moldovans are in no condition to re-establish control over Pridnestrovia. Alongside this, if the Ukrainians did go into Pridnestrovia, the opposition in Moldova would probably get very radical and very militant. So now you have a potential revolutionary situation in Moldova, because as it stands to this point, which I was going to come on to in a second, but I'll quickly brief here. There are large protests in Moldova looking to overturn the government, the liberal government, and it seems that they have a significant amount of Russian support and organization behind them. So if the Ukrainians did go into Pridnestrovia, it's very likely that there could be a revolutionary situation in Moldova. So that would mean that potentially the Ukrainian army would have to go into Moldova to stabilize the situation in Moldova. So alongside fighting the Russians, keeping troops on the north of the border of Belarus, the Ukrainians would have to deploy potentially tens of thousands of men and equipment to police the situation in Moldova and Pridnestrovia, to keep the situation there. Because if the Ukrainians, say, just went into Pridnestrovia but then go into Moldova, well, the chances are the government in Moldova would fall to a pro-Russian government, and then the Ukrainians just have the same problem but on a larger scale in Moldova. Because I can't see the Romanians saying, okay, we're going to send the army into Moldova to establish control, because largely the Romanians have had a very nuanced position on the war in Ukraine, unlike, say, the Poles or the Slovaks and the Czechs. The Romanians are kind of halfway between their position and the Romanians. The Romanians they'll support sending equipment, some parts of equipment, and transfer equipment through Romania into Ukraine, but they are very much hands-off. They don't want to be an active participant. They don't want to stoke the fires of it. They're suffering a lot economically because of the disruption of the markets in Ukraine. Romania isn't about to send its army into police Moldova if the Ukrainians go in to hand it over to them, for lack of a better term. So that's kind of the situation that we're at the moment. This is why I don't think the Ukrainians will go into Pridnestrovia, at least not at this stage. Too many fronts at this point, and there are only negatives at this stage. Say if the Ukrainians eventually got to the stage where they're pushing the Russians out of the Donbass and they're about to invade Crimea, maybe then that is a scenario where the Ukrainians could decide, okay, now it's time to finish this Russian enclave at the west of the country. But before then, there's only negatives for the Ukrainians, any Ukrainian intervention into Pridnestrovia or Moldova. Because alongside this, there are a lot of people who would probably take up arms and start their own insurgency against the Ukrainians if they did do that, or against the Romanians if they were forcibly, not the Romanians, the Moldovans, if they were forcibly integrated into Moldova. So that's just to sort of nip that little situation in the bud. But liberal government in Moldova over the past year has really sort of been pushing up the drive to westernization. They're rolling back on the concept of Moldovism. Again, Moldovism, the concept that Moldova is its own unique nation and Moldovans are their own people separate from Romanians. The Moldovan government, the liberal government, has started to roll back on that in a big way. It has now downgraded the Moldovan language and said that there is no such thing as, well, Moldovan is a dialect. It is actually Romanian. Moldovan is a dialect of Romanian. I don't speak either language, so it's not my place to comment there. This has sort of stoked the fires even more of the Moldovan opposition. So they're sort of seeing the country potentially preparing itself for unification with Romania or a sellout to Western interests. The Russians, so you have the protest movement starting to build up. You now have certain Russian influences starting to emerge in Moldova. You have the Moldovan government coming out and making various claims on the basis of Western and Moldovan intelligence, quote unquote, saying that Moldovan politicians, without explicitly naming them, but it's pretty obvious they're talking about the opposition, are actually Russian agents. They're bought by the Russians. That Russia is encouraging protests, that Russia is destabilizing Moldova, that the Russians were attempting to organize a coup in Moldova last year. These are the claims from the Moldovan government. It should be said that current polling, last time I checked, is that the Moldovan government is looking to decisively lose the next election to the opposition. So the pro-Russian opposition is decisively in the lead for the parliamentary elections. In terms of the presidential elections, the incumbent president is leading, like significantly leading. So the liberal president is far ahead of all the rivals, but she is far below a majority. So I believe she has like 20% approval, whereas all the other Moldovan politicians are like 5 and below 10%. But that 20% is far below a majority. So that's kind of the situation of the internal dynamics in Moldova. I'm really rattling through this as fast as I can, and my throat is dying on me. So, the past month or so, you have a lot of spontaneous protests that have started to emerge in Moldova. There was an attempt for the opposition to bus in thousands, tens of thousands of protesters into the capital. The police stopped that. The Moldovan government has alleged that the funds to organize this mass busing of protesters into the capital came from Russia. A lot of the protesters, whenever the police stopped the buses, just marched to the capital. And just to give you an idea, where is the footage? If I can bring up some footage of these protesters as they are active. So this is some of the footage of the protesters. So I'm just going to play some of these videos just to give you an idea of what these protests look like. But just a note, like I say, this is an opposition protest. This is against the Liberal government. Like I say, just the thing to sort of pick up here, you have the top of this is written in the Latin alphabet, and in the bottom you have the Cyrillic Moldovan alphabet as well. And all Moldovan flags, no EU flags, no NATO flags. So this is kind of what defines the opposition, this sort of Moldovan national identity. So I'll go through, play some of the footage of these protests so you guys can have a visual idea of what it looks like. That was the same footage. I thought I had more of this, to be honest. I thought I had more footage. Probably have come back. But this was a report from the Moldova government saying that a member of Wagner was trying to enter the country to help organize the protests. Here was one of the reports by the Moldovan government that alleges that certain Russian nationals are the ones who are organizing these sort of agitation groups to destabilize the country. So, revealed to the press Russia's plans to overthrow the Moldovan government. This information, according to him, was revealed by an undercover agent that infiltrated the protest. 10 groups consisting of 10 people were to be organized and tasked with creating incidents with the police. They were to be coordinated by a person from Russia. For such actions, each member was to be paid $10,000 and were also promised political support from certain Moldovan parties. They were not named, but the insinuation is that it was the Communist Party and the Socialist Party. I have no idea how I pronounce that. Added that 7 people were detained yesterday, with 25 more on the run. Among the detained were some have Russian citizenship. Just a quick point on the Russian citizenship. It's not just that these are Russian nationals. A lot of the people will be dual nationals. Almost everyone in Pridnestrovia holds Moldovan and Russian citizenship or Ukrainian citizenship. In Moldova, a lot of people in Moldova will hold Russian citizenship as well, or Romanian citizenship. Russian citizenship is sort of a geopolitical tool of Russia. It's called passportization. If you have a lot of people who hold your passport and are your citizen operating and living in a certain area, and it's not part of your country, that gives a lot of influence to you that if they're oppressed, Say if they vote for a political party and that political party is largely shut down and it's mostly voted by people of your nationality, well, you can start to say, well, this is discrimination in oppression of people of your nationality in that country. In terms of territories where Russia actively controls, sort of in southern Ukraine and in the Donbass, the big push to pick up Russian passports is, well, it integrates those territories into Russia. So Crimea, the annexed parts of southern Ukraine and in the Donbass, if the population there is largely picking up Russian passports, it's kind of a tacit indicator that I'm not saying this has happened, it is happening in certain cases, but in other cases it's not. But if the population is picking up Russian passports, it's a tacit implication that the people there in the occupied territories are open to the idea of assimilation, integration into Russia. Alongside this, if a Ukrainian national picks up Russian citizenship in one of these territories, well, then they're open to treason and criminal prosecution from Ukraine if these territories were to return to Ukraine. So that invests that individual into the idea of supporting the Russian actions in this area and to becoming part of Russia. Not too sure on the specifics in Abkhazia, but it's a big part of what the Russian actions in South Ossetia, alongside South Ossetian passports, which obviously South Ossetia is almost universally non-recognized, so they can't really use South Ossetian passports. Sort of the gateway to allow South Ossetians to operate elsewhere in the world is they'll also pick up a Russian passport. So if South Ossetia was in some way to become part of Georgia, that destabilizes South Ossetia and makes it harder for Georgia to potentially integrate South Ossetia into Georgia if everyone's holding Russian citizenship. But if South Ossetia does end up joining with North Ossetia as a subject of the Russian Federation, well, the assimilation and integration of South Ossetia into Russia goes a lot smoothly if most South Ossetians are already Russian nationals. So that's sort of how Russian citizenship operates around these frozen conflicts and how it operates in Moldova and in Pridnestrovia. It should be said that it's not all... It is cynical, but it's not just cynical. The reason a lot of people will pick up this stuff is because in southern Ukraine, they can start picking up Russian pensions to open new bank accounts to operate within the state infrastructure that's established here. Well, you need to be a Russian national. A large thing for Ukrainians in the occupied territories, the liberated territories, whatever way you want to mention it. If they pick up a Russian citizenship, they can claim a Russian pension. Alongside that, they might also be able to claim a Ukrainian pension. So a lot of pensioners are picking this up. So a lot of pensioners are actually surprisingly, seemingly in favor of the integration into Russia and southern Ukraine, just going by anecdotal and various reports I've seen here or there. But that's one aspect of why people do pick up Russian citizenship. The same for Pridnestrovia. A lot of Pridnestrovians have Moldovan and Russian citizenship, and through that they try to claim two pensions or state benefits. So that's kind of a personal economic reason why individuals might pick up a Russian passport. And like I say, Pridnestrovians, no one's really going to recognize a Pridnestrovian passport whenever they try to travel abroad. So they'll either pick up a Moldovan or a Russian or both in order to conduct international travel and engage in international commerce. So that's kind of the quick assessment of passportization. So whenever you have certain, like Moldovans would come out and say, this person we've arrested who was organizing these protests was a Russian national. The implication that they're making there is that this is a Russian agent. This is someone sent by the Russian state, of which there are people like that. There will be more than a few Russian agents active in Moldova organizing these protests. But at the same time, a lot of people in Moldova will have Russian citizenship, and the Russian opposition, being more pro-Russian, they are by and large going to pick up the chance to have a Russian passport if they can. So again, this is actually quite analogous to the Northern Irish issues. So I'm British. I feel myself British. I hold a British passport. I am Northern Irish as well. So if you're pro-British in Northern Ireland, you're more likely than not to pick up a British passport. But you are also entitled to an Irish passport, which you can pick up. But by the by, if you're an Irish nationalist in Northern Ireland, well, you're probably unlikely to pick up a British passport. You're more likely to pick up an Irish passport. So it's that kind of dynamic. If you're pro-Westernization and liberal in Moldova, chances are you'll probably go more for a Romanian passport and a Moldovan passport. If you're more pro the opposition and Russia-leaning in Moldova, you're more likely to pick up a Moldovan and Russian passport. So whenever you see sort of outlets saying this person was a Russian national, well, they could very well be a Russian agent, but also a lot of people just by the by in of themselves will hold Russian citizenship. So that's a little nuance to take on the passportization issue there. So where we were looking at a telegram there. Where's my telegram? So, going back a bit more to last month. No. Could have sworn I had a lot more. I'm sure the Wallachian Gazette will have footage of the protest. So I just wanted to show a bit more of the protest. Just it's one thing for me to spurg out autism at you guys. But I think it's best if you guys just sort of have a visualization of what this stuff looks like. So I'm going to go through this, just play some footage of some scenes on the ground in Moldova of these protests. Mostly to give my throat a bit of a rest, but also so you guys can look at something other than a map.
Voi sunteți diversioniști! Cunoaște că la toate protestele noastre am îndemnat și demnum.
So I've kind of left off the names because I'm mostly they slipped my mind running through this very quickly, but also I'm a bit hesitant to horrifically mispronounce these. But just to give you a bit of context in this footage, the Shore Party is the populist nationalist pro-Russian right-wing party. Maya, let's see, I would call that Maria, but Maya Sandu, that is the incumbent liberal pro-Western Moldovan president.
Lumea în continuare să protesteze pașnic, fiindcă acesta este dreptul nostru. Rușine! 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 Stimați prieteni, noi niciodată nu am îndemnat să fim agresivi. Noi suntem la un protest pașnic. Noi protestăm pașnic împotriva acestei guvernări. Este dreptul nostru de a protesta. Jos Maia Sandu! Jos Maia Sandu! Jos Maia.
So yeah, so you have the Shore Party, the Party of Socialists and the Party of Communists. They are the pro-Russian, more Russia-leaning parties, and then the Party of Action and Solidarity, which is the liberal government, is the incumbent government in Moldova. And let's have a quick look. Oh no, it's changed. So it's a good thing I just looked that up because it's flipped since I last paid interest to this. But we'll just have a quick look at polling in Moldova, just to give you an idea of where the current political balance is. This flipped. I think the protests might have galvanized support for the government, but red and green combined are sort of the pro-Russian leaning parties, liberal being the liberal, and as you can see, the liberals have sort of rebounded quite heavily in the past month. I think that's probably because a lot of this will be all these claims that Russian coups, Russian protests being instigated and like has probably reaffirmed a bit of support for the government. So that's actually flipped since I last paid interest to this. So we'll have to pay a bit of attention going to this forward. So the government's currently on the rebound. The Shore Party seems to have taken a big hit. But this is just one poll. There's always problems and anomalies with polling, but that's what the trend seems to be at the moment, so I'll have to try and keep an eye on this going forward. But as you can see here, last year, whenever the war was starting to go forward, the opposition really started to rebound in July. Oh, that is that. Oh, pardon me. So, just go through a bit more of this footage because my throat is about to die. And I've got hiccups now, so I play a bit of footage just while I try not to die.
Moldova. Vrem să spunem tuturor, cei care vin și protestează aici în Chișinău, sunt poporul Republicii Moldova. Noi nu suntem împotriva Uniunii Europene. Noi nu suntem împotriva Statelor Unite. Noi nu suntem împotriva României. Noi nu suntem împotriva Rusiei. Noi suntem pentru Republica Moldova. Moldova! Moldova!
So, obviously I don't speak Moldovan Romanian, and I'm sure very few of you guys do, but hopefully you can sort of see the captions that come up here. Senior Short Party member Dinu Turacanu affirmed, "We are not against the EU, we are not against the US, we are not against Russia, we are for Moldova." So the train of the protest seems to be very much sort of a sovereignist sort of message, a reaffirmment of Moldovan national identity and Moldovan sovereignty against foreign powers. Obviously that's packaged a bit more because these people would not want to join the EU or NATO, and they're probably a lot more pro-Russian than they might let on, but that's not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. But just a little nuance there. Forgive me, I'm gonna have to play a few more of these because my throat is dying.
Пошли дистанцію.
Пошли дистанцію до мене. Ліна! На трепку! На трепку свою мене
Снимай, толкнул! Чего вы все? Чего вы? Что ты на одного?
Луацию за комментацию. Луацию, причина. Я остановил.
So, as I was saying, that was some footage of where the police blocked the buses from bringing protesters into the city. So the protesters just got off the buses and marched into the city themselves. So, if you forgive me, I might just play a couple more of these because my throat is. I need to quickly take a strepsil. Apologies for this, guys, but I'll try and keep stuff on screen. So as you can see, the protests are tense, but they're not violent. It's not a revolutionary, but they are certainly tense. There is a fundamental collision happening between sort of the visions of what Moldova is. Should Moldova exist as an independent state? Is Moldova a European state, or is it a more Russian aligned state? Is Moldovans even a people? As such, sort of fundamental national questions that have been raised because of the influence of what's happening in Ukraine. So in many ways, the situation in Ukraine is bringing a lot of these sort of frozen conflicts and national questions to the core, the front. So that's kind of a rundown. I think I took about an hour and a half doing that. Forgive me if I waffled on a bit more, but you know me and my autism. That's kind of the situation happening in Moldova at the moment, in Pridnestrovia, sort of to shed a bit of nuance and light into what is happening there for you guys. Keep an eye on it. We'll have to see where the protests go, if they build momentum. If you want, yeah, I tell you what, Bald and Bankrupt, you know, my favorite YouTuber ever, as always. He did a few videos in Moldova. If you're sort of interested in sort of like just seeing what the country is like, they're probably the best thing to go look at. This is a very poor country in terms of European standards. I think this is the poorest country in Europe, off the top of my head. I say the only real economic industry here is agriculture, and it has been significantly disrupted by the situation in Ukraine. And even before the situation in Ukraine, this is a country that is exceedingly decrepit and exceedingly corrupt. If you go watch some of Bald and Bankrupt's videos on it, you'll sort of see the urban decay that is endemic in Moldova. You're talking about entire towns just left to ruin. Public infrastructure is decrepit, pretty depressing. So, and now that's even worse because of the situation in Ukraine. And Moldova, kind of in a smaller facet as to what Ukraine is sort of stuck between this two conflicting visions of what the country should be, and stuck between the machinations of larger outside powers. The only other thing really to wrap up here is that the Ukrainians have started to dig trenches along the eastern bank of a border of Pridnestrovia. Again, I think it's just more for show rather than a potential sign of imminent intent. So that's Moldova. Oh boy. Georgia, Moldova. What is the name of this stream? Of drones, Moldovans, Pridnestrovians, and Georgians. So I need to touch drones. So now we come to drones. I wish they kind of had it on this map, but I'll bring back the Telegram. Where is it? I'm sure most of you are aware there is a lot of argy-bargy going about because of a drone. Situation with a drone over the Black Sea. Yesterday, it was reported that an American Reaper drone, a surveillance drone, had crashed into the sea. Yesterday? Was it showing up? Yeah, yesterday. Monday? Was it actually Monday or was it Tuesday? Yeah, Tuesday. So this is a press release from the U.S. Air Force. Was it U.S. Air Force? Some U.S. government body. A Russian aircraft collides into a U.S. unmanned drone in international waters. A Russian Su-27. I believe that there was two of them involved. Initial reports said that the drone might have actually been shot down, or that the Russian aircraft physically hit it. That doesn't seem to be the case now that more has emerged. From my understanding is the drone was 60 miles south of Sevastopol, operating around in this area. The Russian aircraft came up and intercepted it. In the process of that, one of the Su-27s, from what the Americans say, was constantly harassing the drone. It was flying in front of it. It was trying to disrupt its flight paths, and then it ended up discharging fuel onto the drone. which then caused the drone to lose control and fall out of the sky and land into the sea. This is significant. US aircraft, drones and Russian aircraft have had this happen before. I believe there was actually a collision a couple years ago between a Russian aircraft and a drone over the Black Sea. But this is kind of note because obviously the situation in Ukraine, but how close this thing was to Sevastopol. Like I say, it was about 60 international waters is 15-30 miles, so it's fairly close to Sevastopol. Generally, whenever the Russians, the Americans and NATO are doing AWACS in the intelligence and surveillance aircraft, they fly fairly out to sea over the Black Sea and along NATO borders. This thing was apparently operating without a transponder, and the Russians tracked it, and it was coming extremely close to their airspace, and the Russians intercepted it. The other thing why I think the Russians brought it down was a couple last week. I need to stop doing this. I keep moving my Telegram app. There you go. There it is there. Last week, the Americans made a very big show with a B-52. For people who are, I'm sure most of you guys know this, B-52 is a strategic bomber. It can carry nuclear warheads. Is a very old aircraft. It was first entered service in the 50s, but it's a strategic bomber. It was specifically designed to bomb Moscow and Soviet cities. Still in service and is part of the strategic deterrent that the United States uses. And as part of this, for example, as part of the build-up, I thought I had it. As part of the American quote-unquote reassurance to its eastern allies in NATO. Since the war in Ukraine, but even before the war in Ukraine, American and NATO, British and French and German troops have been deploying a lot to the Baltic states, particularly Estonia, because Estonia has a very large, all these states have a large Russian minority, but Estonia is especially key because of the closeness between St. Petersburg and all the Russian military assets around St. Petersburg to Estonia, which is a NATO state, and particularly the city of Narva, which is majority ethnic Russian. So the NATO's kind of made a showing to deploy a lot of its troops to Estonia on various parades and such. As part of this, especially since the war has become quite prominent for the Americans to display its quote weapons of deterrence, its deterrence capability. So as part of this, my internet just died. Am I still here, chat, or is my internet just died? Please don't tell me my internet's dead. No, internet's still here. I don't know why this footage isn't playing. Okay, I'll play it. I'll just quickly give it a quick while it loads. A B-52 is kind of like one of those big symbols of deterrence, nuclear deterrence that the Americans can rely on. So as part of this, the Americans have been flying B-52s over Eastern European countries, across Baltic states, as sort of a signal to the Russians that, yeah, we have nuclear bombers and we'll fly them close to your borders. So think very carefully about the actions you'll take. So now that this video seems to fully load, this was last month, where is a very prominent display, alongside whenever the Ukrainians sent that destroyed tank for the Estonians to display in Tallinn, alongside the deployment of NATO troops to Estonia. The Americans made a very big showing of flying a B-52 fairly low over Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. So I'll just play out footage now for you guys. So why am I showing you this footage? Well, one, these aircraft often work with transponders unless they're on a combat mission. You see them on flight radar, but the reason why these are flying so low is because they are to be seen. They are there to be seen by the Estonians and also especially by the Russians. One, they fly so low so the Estonians can see them, so the Estonians feel reassured that the Americans are there to defend them, but also by flying them so low and in such a public way, the Russians, so that there is a message sent to the Russians that we are here with our strategic weapons, and again, just think very carefully about your actions. So in a way, it's kind of a deterrence, but it's also an aggressive act. At least that's how the Russians perceive them. So that was last month, but a couple days ago, last week, this moved to a new stage, which makes me think that there was a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that have yet to come out. But so a B-52 skirted the borders of Russia, but this very particularly, it was of note to me. This is a simulated attack run that it conducted on St. Petersburg. These aircraft don't physically, almost certainly the B-52, if war did come to it, it isn't going to fly specifically over the city and drop a bomb onto it in the way like World War II or Nagasaki or Hiroshima. The way these aircraft would deploy their nuclear weapons is kind of like how the Russians deploy their missiles into Ukraine. It's a standoff weapon. They'll fly to a point and fire a cruise missile. And this is likely what this was doing. This is a simulated attack run on St. Petersburg, and it was very clear. As you can see, that we can see it. It was tracked, flight transponder on for everyone to see it. And very especially, I think that they wanted the Russians to see it. I don't know if I really need to go into explain it, but flying straight up the Gulf of Finland, straight towards St. Petersburg, pulls off before it reaches Russian national waters, but that is very evidently it was a trialing. It was an attack drill that it conducted. So obviously the Russians are not going to be very keen on this if the Americans are flying bombers, strategic bombers, straight at their borders in very obvious attack runs. So why was this so public? Why did the Americans make this very obvious drill open for the world to see, most of all the Russians? I think potentially behind the scenes the Americans have gotten some intelligence that the Russians might have been planning something, maybe some kind of new escalatory measure. Some people have said that the Russians were planning to nuke Ukraine. I don't think that is it, but I think there's been a game of nuclear brinksmanship that's been building over the past since the war began. Various countries pulling out, particularly the Russians, out of nuclear arms treaties. I think what the Russians are probably building up to is potentially to conduct a nuclear test somewhere in the north, on Novaya Zemlya. I think it is that big island where they did their nuclear tests. I think that's probably what the Russians are starting to move towards, is a message of intent. Maybe, and this is just speculation on my end, maybe American intelligence have sort of gotten the message that the Russians might be planning that. Maybe there was something else. Maybe there was something, some other escalation or some other intelligence the Americans have gotten. And this was the way of the Americans to demonstrate that they know about it, and for the Russians to think differently about it, to reconsider their actions about what the Americans might have figured out. Because alongside this obvious attack run at St. Petersburg, this aircraft proceeded on its passage along the Baltic states, and it flew right along Kaliningrad within 10 miles. So this is one thing. This is a provocation in of itself, clearly flying at St. Petersburg and pulling back. But this is still a couple hundred miles away from there's Russian territorial waters because of these islands in the Gulf of Finland, but it's still a couple hundred miles from actual Russian territory, as it were. But then this aircraft then flew down, still in NATO territory, as is its right, but the fact that it flew within 10 miles of Kaliningrad, a very particular and contentious place at this point of time, also sends another message. I can imagine that Russian air control, local air control and defense operators in Kaliningrad were paying very close attention to this B-52 during its pass. So also this aircraft, I believe it came all the way from the United States. It came from a base outside of, I think it might have been Alabama. I forgot where the B-52s are based, but this flew all the way from the United States. So it was a transcontinental drill that it conducted. So why am I talking so much about B-52s whenever we're talking about the drone? I think the Russians brought down the drone in response to this. I think this was the Russian response to the drone, to the B-52. This was a provocation to the Russians, and the Russian response to that, well, the Russians could either shoot down the B-52 or an American aircraft, or they could bring down an unmanned aircraft, but also send a message of intent that, one, you've had a B-52 do drills right on our border. Now you've got drones basically flying off the coast of Sevastopol. Back off. Well, we're not going to sit by and allow this. So I think that was the drone issue has to be seen within the context of the B-52s, and also as a statement of intent that Western and NATO AWACS and intelligence missions over the Black Sea have been getting a bit more bolder as of late. This is sort of like the Russian shot across the bow. We'll take down your drones if they press too far, and a warning has been sent. So that's the way I think we have to view the drone issue. Another aspect of it, I think I prematurely suggested that the Russians have recovered the drone. It doesn't appear yet. It appears that the Russians are planning to access the drone. The Americans at the moment are trying to parlay with the Turks to allow a US Navy ship to potentially go up and get the wreckage of the drone if they can, because it's somewhere in territorial waters. I don't think the Turks are really minded to do that, because allowing a US Navy ship into an active war zone whenever you have Ukrainian, well, obviously Ukrainians will be kept well within the purview of what the Americans are doing and where they're doing it, but with all the shenanigans going on in the Western Black Sea, I don't think the Turks are really minded and at the best relations with the United States to allow US Navy ships into the Black Sea and in contravention of the Montreux Convention. I think the Russians are really interested in it because they want to get their hands on American drone technology. The Russians do have drones, but their drones really are, their drone campaign pales in comparison to Western states. This is where pouring billions of rubles into nuclear weapons, into Armageddon, doomsday weapons, nuclear torpedoes that can sink the British Isles, or Sarmat, intercontinental hypersonic missiles. Yeah, they all sound good and they're really cool, but that's billions and billions of rubles that have gone into stuff that you will probably never use. Whereas had you used them into building up a drone program, or just not having it stolen by various generals and corrupt officials, probably would have fared them better in Ukraine. The Russian drone program is really, for a country of its size, pretty poor. This is why they're buying their drones from Iran. There is a sort of analogous Russian drone to the Reaper that was taken down, but they are in very small numbers, and it's I don't think they've ever been seen in Ukraine yet, or I think they might have been seen a couple of times. Most Russian surveillance drones are things like the Orlan, which competent drone is of itself, but it's nothing special. So I think the Russians, having been caught on the back foot in terms of drones through the war, have decided, well, if we can make a sort of message, we might be able to send a warning to the Americans to back off. Maybe we can sort of get our hands on one of their drones. I'm thinking things like the optics, just what surveillance equipment that the Americans have in these drones, I think will be of particular interest to the Russians, and not only the Russians, because the Russians have a growing strategic cooperation with Iran. As part of the payment for all the drones that Iran has sent Russia, Russia has had, alongside financial and material resources. They're also sending a lot of captured Western weaponries, things like the NLAWs, Javelin and the like, to Iran for reverse engineering. So I think part of this, if the Russians, which they almost certainly will, get their hands on the drone, part of that technology will probably go to Iran to build up the Iranian drone program. So we'll probably build up this cooperation axis between Iran and Russia, because Russia is also going to send Su-37. So no, Su-35. They've signed tenders to supply Su-35 to Iran as well. So that is the drone issue. Let me see. Okay, with the subjects, I'll not go into the stuff that's happened in Ukraine. I might do another stream on it that week. So I'll not update events in Ukraine as such. I'll look to do a stream in the next couple days specifically on developments in Ukraine. So I think that is stuff I was looking to touch. Let me have a quick look. Yeah, I think that is... Oh, yeah. Just a quick thing, just to give you an idea of the scale of the drone. This is a Reaper, a French Reaper, but this is the size of the drone that was brought down. If you're sort of you want to sort of see what the scale of the thing we're talking about is. But let me have a quick scroll and see if I guess the only other thing while we're on the external stuff, just a quick note on Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan's continuing its strategic pivot away from Russia. I might do a specific stream on Kazakhstan at some point, but Kazakhstan is very quickly moving out of Russia's orbit. It's using this moment of weakness that Russia has gotten itself into in Ukraine to reassess itself, and is strongly pushing out of Russia's orbit. In a way, that's guaranteed by China, because China and Kazakhstan have a very close relationship, so that's going to preclude any Russian military intervention into Kazakhstan if it was ever to come. But also Kazakhstan is looking for Western capital and technology to revitalize its resource and hydrocarbon sector. But alongside this, there was an interesting report the past couple last week, where the Kazakh state has started to physically appropriate Russian state assets from Roscosmos. Roscosmos is the Russian state space industry. Where is Baikonur? I should know this off the top of my head. Baikonur is like over here to the Baikonur. There it is there. Tell you what, I'll go on to Google Maps for this just to have a look. Just a quick explanation of this. So Baikonur Cosmodrome was set up under the Soviet Union. It was where the first man went into space. Yuri Gagarin is where Sputnik was launched into space. It was the Soviet civil space industry. There, have they really changed the name of it? No. It's wrong city. Since the collapse of the USSR and Kazakhstan became its own independent state, the Russians have a lease on Baikonur and the nearby city of Baikonur. So you have the city of Baikonur, and then you have the actual rockets facility. The rocket facility is under joint administration, from my understanding, but there's like a specific designation about what is whose. but the Kazakhs have claimed that Roscosmos and the Russians have not been fulfilling various lease and terms of the lease and paying various payments. So it hasn't specified what exactly was taken, but this article here came out in Kazakh today. I tried to find it, but I can't read Kazakh. There's a story going around that the Kazakh state has started to appropriate various property of Roscosmos in terms of lease obligations that the Russians have failed to make in Kazakhstan to the Kazakh government. So that was another thing that came up that I'd be looking to pay attention to. I might do my own specific stream on Kazakhstan at some point if it becomes much more of an issue. Can't even find that city now. So with that, yeah, with that, I think over to the super chats then. Let me just have a quick look, see if I've missed anything. Otherwise, I'll go into any super chats people have sent. Oh, how long has this stream gone? 2 hours. I know, as long as usual, but yeah. So let's have a look. I'll do a regular update stream on events in Ukraine. How long is this? Later in the week. No super chats today. No super chats for Michael today. Oh, I've broken my throat for nothing. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Is there anything you guys want to ask me before I wrap out the video? Someone told me that Russia has the best hackers because it has the worst computers. Just getting them to work right takes high-end programming skills. Are the new Northrop Grumman stealth bombers active? I don't think so. I think they're still on the B2s. Anyone got anything they want to quickly ask before I round it out? If you want to grow this channel, you should take a bunch of conflict footage like you did at your intro and make short videos with clickbaity titles. Yeah, probably. That video Bob Minecraft did on the Soviet space shuttle was interesting. Okay. Well, I guess the only thing at that stage then is follow my stuff. Why isn't this working? So if you're not already, be sure to come and follow me on Twitter. That would be nice. Also, I'm sure most of you guys are on my Telegram already, but just in case anyone isn't, be sure to come follow my Telegram. I should really try and get back on the Odyssey stuff as well. I need to get more. Felix's documentary has been released, so if you haven't watched that, be sure to go and check that out. Link is, it's the pinned comment in the Telegram channel. That's why we went to Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary last year, so be sure to go check that and give Felix some love. Throw links in chat. All right. That's the Telegram going in chat now. If you aren't in the Telegram, this is the Twitter account. And this is the link to Felix's documentary. Oh yeah, I think I need to put them up in this video, but might not have been tonight. But if you do like what I do and you are minded to throw some coins my way, that'd be very kind. I'll put the links in the relevant links below to the video. If you are minded to do that. Otherwise, you can find them on my other videos. It's all greatly appreciated and makes it all worthwhile. Thank you so much to the people who do. Lucas Misna, thank you so much for $20 US with a sticker thing. I think that's the first time I've ever gotten a sticker thing. Thank you so much. It's greatly appreciated. Guess the other thing then is I will almost certainly be doing another stream. What is today? Is today Thursday or Wednesday? Wednesday. Might do it tomorrow, might do it on Saturday, an update on events actually in Ukraine, as this stream has been non-stop around Ukraine. I'll do an actual Ukraine stream tomorrow or Saturday. I'll keep you guys updated. Going over the latest updates in the situation around Bakhmut. And also I'm thinking of having a little chat about Russian tanks modernization and some stuff that's come out on the Russian tank fleet about what might or might not be happening with those. So with that, thank you so much everyone who's come along. It's always appreciated. Hope you guys enjoyed this and got some stuff out of me spurging for a couple hours, and hope to see you guys again soon. Thank you very much and have a great evening wherever you are. Paka paka, auf Wiedersehen, goodbye.